Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one. A child survivor reduced to skin and bones by starvation and the horrors of Auschwitz is carefully removed from a barrack by Soviet rescuers shortly after the camp's liberation in January 1945. Jews walking in line to the gas chambers. Many believed they were going for disinfectant showers, unaware that they were only minutes away from being murdered. The gas chambers were one of the main instruments of Nazi extermination, where more than 1 million people lost their lives. A prisoner loses consciousness in a compression chamber during a medical experiment simulating high altitudes. Conducted in the Dachau concentration camp in Germany in 1942, these experiments were brutal and often fatal. Prisoners were used as unwilling test subjects, suffering in the name of the Nazi regime's pseudoscientific tests. A large pile of human ashes found at the Majdanek concentration camp in Poland. Majdanek was one of the first camps discovered by the Allies, revealing direct evidence of the mass extermination carried out by the Nazis. The ashes were what remained of prisoners murdered in the gas chambers and cremated in the camp's furnaces. It is estimated that more than 78,000 people, mostly Jews, were killed at Majdanek. Relatives saying goodbye to a child through a gate at the Warsaw ghetto central prison, where elderly and children were kept before being deported to the Chełmno extermination camp in Poland. This moment occurred during the Gespera action between September 5th and 12th of 1942, when the Nazis forced the removal of more than 15,000 children, elderly and sick people from the ghetto. The deportation of Jewish children from an orphanage in the Warsaw ghetto during the Gespera action. The children from the orphanage, many still too young to understand what was happening, were placed on trucks and sent to the Chełmno extermination camp, where they were murdered in mobile gas chambers. A Jewish prisoner in a tank of ice-cold water used as a guinea pig for Nazi hypothermia experiments. These tests were conducted by Nazi doctors in concentration camps. The Nazis sought to determine how long a person could survive in extreme temperatures and test methods of resuscitation for use on German soldiers. Victims were forced to remain in freezing water for long periods, often until death. Prisoners line up for roll call in the concentration camp between 1942 and 1944. Forced to salute the regime that condemned them daily, this humiliation symbolized the Nazis' absolute control. Women deemed fit for labor walk in a line at the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, their heads shaved and identities erased, a symbol of Nazi dehumanization. A baby is handed over to an officer at the Westerbork transit camp in the Netherlands between 1943 and 1944. Under the cold gaze of the Nazis, innocent children were separated from their families and sent to extermination camps such as Auschwitz. This image shows the brothers Israel and Zelig posing for a photo. Shortly after the picture was taken, both were brutally murdered by the Hitler regime, accused of belonging to an inferior race under the pretext of racial purification, concepts widely propagated by the regime. A measuring device is carefully placed on an individual's ear, part of the pseudoscientific practices used in Nazi Germany to determine racial ancestry. Tools like this were designed to measure specific physical traits, serving the ideology of racial purity and justifying policies of exclusion and persecution. At the same institute in Berlin, racial hygienists measured detailed facial features, as seen in this photo of a woman being subjected to an analysis of her facial characteristics. These measurements lacked scientific basis, but served as tools to fuel the beliefs of the Nazi system. The Nazis used public exhibitions like this one to spread their racial ideology. The poster, titled "The Biology of Growth," shows the stages of growth of the Nordic race, reinforcing the pseudoscience that supported their vision of racial supremacy. This propaganda, widely disseminated, served as the basis for discrimination and genocide policies that culminated in the horrors of concentration camps. Prisoners on a death march from Dachau. During this forced march, thousands of prisoners were moved from concentration camps to other locations further south as the Allied forces approached. Many of these prisoners, already weakened, died along the way, and those who could not keep up were executed on sight. Prisoners of Dachau are forced on a death march toward their own execution. Exhausted and starving, they walked in silence, tormented by the certainty that even greater horrors awaited them. In this image from May 1945, German civilians from the town of Nammering, under orders from United States military authorities, dig graves for the victims of a death march from the Buchenwald concentration camp. After kilometers of suffering and exhaustion, the prisoners died en masse. This forced act exposed the horrors many civilians claim to be unaware of, confronting them with the brutal reality of the Nazi regime. Brutal forced sterilization experiments being conducted by the Nazi doctor Karl Klauberg, seen in this photo at Block 10 of Auschwitz, Poland, between 1941 and 1944. Prisoners were subjected to painful and inhumane procedures, treated as test subjects in the name of Nazi pseudoscience. This image, taken from a film produced by the Reich Ministry of Propaganda, was created to promote the regime's practices. It shows two doctors in a wing of an asylum described as life as merely a burden. Designed to promote the Nazi euthanasia program, the production manipulated public opinion to justify the systematic killing of people with disabilities, portraying them as a burden to society and the state. Members of the stormtroopers blocked the entrance to a Jewish store in Berlin, Germany on April 1, 1933, with signs that read, "Germans, defend yourselves, do not buy from Jews." This boycott was one of the first steps in the Nazi campaign of segregation and hatred, which culminated in the concentration camps. A footbridge over Chlodna Street connects two parts of the Warsaw ghetto, while the street below remained off-limits to Jews. Built by the Nazis, it symbolized extreme segregation, where Jews were confined with no contact with Germans, who were considered superior. A prisoner has his head shaved in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, Germany, in 1942. Shaving heads was part of the Nazi dehumanization process, erasing the individuality of the victims. In this capture, uniformed prisoners marked with triangular badges are gathered by Nazi guards at Sachsenhausen concentration camp. The colors of the triangles define their so-called crime, such as being a political enemy, a Jehovah's Witness, a gypsy, or a homosexual. This visual segregation system was part of the rigid Nazi control. In another photo, we see that during inspections at the Buchenwald concentration camp, prisoners also wore the iconic striped uniforms, identified by numbers and colored triangles categorizing them. In various areas of concentration camps, this sign was displayed with illustrations codifying prisoner categories, such as triangles for political enemies and homosexuals. Introduced between 1937 and 1938, this system was used in Dachau and other camps, sewn into uniforms to quickly identify each prisoner. In this image, we see one of the corporal punishment practices inflicted by the SS in the Dachau concentration camp in 1945. Prisoners were tied to a table while guards brutally whipped them, often to the point of unconsciousness. Witold Pilecki, a Polish soldier, did the unthinkable. He volunteered to be imprisoned in Auschwitz. His mission was to gather evidence of Nazi atrocities and inform the world about the Holocaust. During nearly 3 years in the camp's hell, he organized a secret resistance and managed to escape in 1943. Pilecki risked everything to expose the horror, becoming a symbol of courage in the face of barbarity. Prisoners in the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria climbing the infamous stairs of death. These steps, made of irregular stones, forced prisoners to carry granite blocks under brutal conditions, resulting in fatal exhaustion for many. Jewish women and their children just before being sent to the gas chambers at Auschwitz. Most children were immediately condemned, as the Nazis did not see them as useful for forced labor. A huge pile of eyeglasses belonging to victims of the Nazi concentration camps, confiscated upon their arrival. Prisoners were forced to surrender all their belongings, including glasses, shoes, jewelry, and clothing, before being sent for forced labor or directly to the gas chambers. The Nazis sorted and stored these items for reuse, sending valuable materials to Germany. Wedding bands and rings confiscated by the Nazis at the Auschwitz concentration camp. Deportees were forced to surrender all their valuables upon arrival at the camp. Items like jewelry, watches, and money were confiscated and sent to Germany. Many couples and families were separated during the selection and never reunited. Photos of Jewish children taken at Auschwitz, displayed at the Auschwitz Memorial and Museum in Auschwitz, located in Poland. These images are part of the Nazi archives, which documented the prisoners deported to the camp, a large amount of clothing belonging to deported Jews. Prisoners were forced to strip as soon as they arrived, before being sent for forced labor or directly to the gas chambers. Their clothes were collected, sorted, and stored by the Nazis, who sent the reusable fabrics to Germany. German soldiers abusing and humiliating a Jewish prisoner by cutting his beard off forcibly, a common act of degradation imposed by the Nazis during the occupation of Poland and the Soviet Union. For religious Jews, the beard was a symbol of identity and tradition, and the Nazis used this practice as a form of dehumanization and public humiliation. Many of these scenes occurred on the streets, where the soldiers laughed and posed for photos. German soldiers interrogating Jews after the Warsaw ghetto uprising, which occurred in April 1943. The uprising began when Nazi forces entered the ghetto to deport the last survivors to extermination camps. The Jewish fighters, even poorly armed and without supplies, were determined to resist and fought the Germans for nearly a month. A group of Jews, including a young boy with his hands raised, being escorted by German soldiers out of the Warsaw ghetto. On this date, Nazi troops began the operation to liquidate the ghetto, facing armed resistance from Jewish fighters in the Warsaw ghetto uprising. Despite the brave fight, the resistance was brutally suppressed. The ruins of the Warsaw ghetto after its complete destruction by the Nazis. After suppressing the Warsaw ghetto uprising, SS troops blew up buildings and leveled the area to the ground, erasing any trace of the Jewish community that had lived there. Of the more than 56,000 Jews captured, about 7,000 were executed on site, while the rest were deported to extermination camps such as Treblinka. The Hartheim Castle in Austria was transformed into a Nazi extermination center during the Euthanasia program. People with physical or mental disabilities were killed by asphyxiation in gas chambers or lethal injections under the pretext of racial purification. The memorial located at the former Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. Bergen-Belsen was established in 1943 and initially functioned as a prisoner camp, but later became a site for indirect extermination, where tens of thousands of people died from hunger, disease, and inhumane conditions. Among the victims was Anne Frank, who died of typhus in 1945. This is the blue and gray striped coat worn by prisoners in the Flossenburg concentration camp. The letter P indicated it belonged to a non-Jewish Polish prisoner. A warehouse in Auschwitz displays piles of clothes stolen from the victims of the escalating genocide. Auschwitz in Poland was the largest extermination camp, where the belongings of the victims were looted, while, tragically, millions were murdered in gas chambers and crematoriums. A Soviet doctor examined survivors of Auschwitz shortly after the camp's liberation in Poland. The extremely emaciated bodies reveal the horrors endured in the extermination camp, where starvation and physical abuse were constant. This photo captures Crematorium 4, still under construction during the winter of 1942 to 1943 at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Poland. This structure, intended for mass extermination, was later destroyed in a major revolt organized by prisoners. In another image, we see Alla Gertner, a determined young woman who later became a prisoner in Auschwitz. There, her strength and courage led her to join the resistance movement in the camp. Alla played a vital role, risking her life to smuggle gunpowder used in the destruction of Crematorium 4, one of the boldest acts against the Nazi regime. Captured, she was executed, but her heroism echoed as a symbol of resistance in the concentration camps. SS guards relax and have fun in the Sobibor extermination camp, while, not far away, gas chambers were taking thousands of lives. The relaxed atmosphere and smiles cruelly contrast with the unimaginable horror inflicted on the victims, highlighting the dehumanization and coldness that permeated the Nazi system. In this photo, the terrifying furnaces of Auschwitz appear as a dark symbol of Nazi cruelty. Typically, 4 to 5 bodies were cremated simultaneously in the ovens in a macabre attempt to erase the evidence of genocide. Salomo Aruch, a Greek-Jewish boxer, survived the horrors of Auschwitz by being forced to fight for his life. As a prisoner, he was compelled to participate in over 200 matches over 2 years, where the fate of the losers was cruel, death in gas chambers or by execution. His strength and skill ensured his survival, but left deep scars. Salomo passed away in 2009 at the age of 86 in Israel. Gita and Lale Sokolov lived a love story born in the hell of Auschwitz. Lale, a Jewish prisoner forced to tattoo numbers on the arms of other captives, met Gita while marking her arm. It was love at first sight. Amid hunger and terror, he risked everything to protect her, saving her life numerous times. After the war, they married and rebuilt their lives together, turning what seemed impossible into a story of resistance and eternal love. During the Holocaust, Stella Kubler-Isaacson, known as the Jewish Hunter, collaborated with the Gestapo to save her family, exposing over 3,000 Jews attempting to escape. In a tragic twist of fate, her own parents and husband were sent to Auschwitz in 1943. Even so, Stella continued working as an informant until the collapse of the Nazi regime in 1945, living with the weight of her choices, a large number of suitcases belonging to people deported to Auschwitz. Prisoners were forced to bring their belongings under the illusion that they would be resettled. Many suitcases had handwritten names and addresses, as their owners believed they would retrieve them. Upon arrival at the camp, most were sent directly to the gas chambers, while the few selected for forced labor lost all their belongings. The belongings left behind by the deportees after the selection at Auschwitz. Suitcases, clothing, shoes, household items, and other personal objects were confiscated by the Nazis as prisoners disembarked from the trains. The deportees were deceived into believing they would be resettled, bringing their most valuable belongings with them. The Nazis forced prisoners, especially those from Sonderkommando, to collect belongings and separate valuables, such as jewelry and gold, to be sent to Germany. These mass looting operations were part of the Nazi regime's economic exploitation policy, while millions were exterminated. After the selection, those sent to death left everything behind, and prisoners forced into slave labor only had striped uniforms. Jewish women with children in their arms walked silently toward the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Each step carried the weight of an unfortunate and tragic fate, where the pain of knowing what awaited them was overshadowed by the effort to comfort their children. 2 children freed from the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland in January 1945 stand hand in hand. Their fragile and emaciated figures reveal the horror they faced. A Romani prisoner subjected to Nazi medical experiments at the Dachau concentration camp in 1944. These experiments aimed to test methods for making seawater drinkable, exposing prisoners to extreme levels of dehydration and suffering. The interior of a gas chamber at Auschwitz. These chambers could accommodate up to 2,500 people at once. To prevent resistance, the Nazis deceived prisoners by telling them they would take a collective shower. After locking the doors, Nazi soldiers used poisonous gas through openings in the ceiling or sides. The gas spread quickly, causing suffocation in minutes. Allied forces soldiers watching survivors of the Ohrdruf concentration camp demonstrating the torture methods used by the Nazis. When the troops arrived, they found bodies scattered, signs of mass executions, and surviving prisoners in critical condition. To help the Allies understand Nazi brutality, some survivors recreated the forms of punishment and torture they had endured, including beatings, hangings, and extreme abuse. Eva Behar, a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp, displaying the prisoner number tattooed on her arm, marked by the Nazis during her time at the camp. At Auschwitz, deportees were registered and tattooed as soon as they arrived, losing their identity and being identified only by a number. A pregnant woman and her children arriving at Auschwitz concentration camp. Many of these people were immediately separated, with women and children often sent to the gas chambers or used in medical experiments. A 13-year-old orphan, a survivor of the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria, shortly after liberation by the United States Army. Extremely weakened by hunger and the harsh conditions of the camp, he was one of the few prisoners who resisted until the end of the war. A young Russian, extremely malnourished during the liberation of Dachau concentration camp, which housed prisoners of various nationalities, including Soviet prisoners captured during the war. German chemist Fritz Haber in his laboratory, responsible for the creation of Zyklon B. Originally developed as a pesticide, Zyklon B was tragically used by the Nazis as the infamous gas to exterminate millions in gas chambers in concentration camps during the Holocaust. The selection process on the Birkenau platform, where deported Jews were immediately divided into two groups by Nazi doctors. In a few seconds, healthy men were sent for forced labor, while women, children, the elderly, and the sick were directed to the gas chambers. A Nazi doctor examining a Jewish prisoner at Auschwitz. These assessments were not real medical exams, but part of the selection process that determined who would be sent for forced labor and who would be executed immediately. SS doctors carried out these triages quickly, often just observing the physical condition of the prisoners. In this photo, Jews from the Lodz ghetto in Poland are forced to board freight trains between 1942 and 1944. The destination was the Chelmno extermination camp, where most met their end in gas chambers. Lodz was the second largest Nazi ghetto, confining over 160,000 people in inhumane conditions. Barracks of the Majdanek concentration camp in Poland are lined up, surrounded by barbed wire. Operating between 1941 and 1944, the camp was used for forced labor and extermination, with more than 78,000 victims, including Jews, prisoners of war, and political dissidents. The furnace room of a crematorium, photographed by the SS just before the construction was completed. The Nazis documented the progress of the constructions to ensure the efficiency of the mass extermination. Even before the camp was liberated, the Nazis attempted to destroy the crematoriums to erase evidence of the genocide. The gallows at the Ohrdruf concentration camp, a subcamp of Buchenwald in Germany, where prisoners were executed by the Nazis. Many prisoners were publicly hanged as punishment or to serve as an example to others. A Mauthausen prisoner is captured in his final attempt at freedom, moments before being killed while trying to jump over the barbed wire fence. His desperate bid to escape the inhumane conditions was brutally interrupted, and for those left behind, the sight of the man hanging was a tragic reminder that even the dream of escape came at a terrible cost. In this poignant image, child prisoners of Auschwitz gaze at the world through a barbed wire fence moments before liberation. A young girl is examined by a German doctor to determine her racial purity, following the cruel and inhumane standards of Nazi ideology. These examinations were part of the policies of racial hygiene, deciding who was deemed worthy of living in the regime's distorted vision. This, in the photo, is Karl. At 26 years old, he was denounced under paragraph 175, which criminalized homosexuality, and was later sent to Neuengamme, where he wore the pink triangle on his uniform for the first time. After defying inhumane orders, he was transferred to Auschwitz, now marked with the red triangle of a political prisoner. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, coldly and disdainfully stares at a prisoner during an official inspection at the Dachau concentration camp, Germany, on May 8, 1936. Jews work under coercion in the construction of the wall that would isolate the Warsaw ghetto from the rest of the city. Announced in October 1940 and sealed in November of the same year, this wall marked the beginning of a deadly confinement. Within it, thousands perished from hunger, disease, and deportations to extermination camps. 2 Jewish children hold bowls of soup in the Warsaw Ghetto, Poland, around 1940. The ghetto, created by the Nazis, housed thousands of Jews in inhumane conditions, and the scarce food available was one of the few chances for survival amid the extreme hunger that plagued the residents, from adults to children. A German soldier oversees Soviet prisoners of war at the Uman concentration camp in Ukraine on August 14, 1941. Mounted on an anti-aircraft gun, he maintains control with explicit orders to shoot anyone attempting to escape. Prisoners perform slave labor at the Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany between 1940 and 1945. Under constant surveillance, they were forced to build railways intended to transport more prisoners to the same fate of suffering. This image shows female survivors of Auschwitz crowded into makeshift barracks shortly after the liberation by the Soviet Army in 1945. Their weary faces and weakened bodies reflected the horrors endured in the camp, where hunger, disease, and violence were part of daily life. In this photo, child survivors emerge from the barracks of Auschwitz in Poland shortly after its liberation by Soviet forces on January 27, 1945. Their faces express confusion and fragility, reflecting the horrors they faced. The Black Wall, located between Block 10 and Block 11 at the Auschwitz concentration camp. This site was used for executions of prisoners, mainly by shooting. Those condemned were taken to the inner courtyard, forced to undress, and positioned in front of the wall, where they were shot. Hundreds of Hungarian Jews, treated like cattle, await their fate in Auschwitz in May 1944. Before the Nazis, they faced a brutal choice: death in gas chambers or exhaustive slavery. The anguish was unimaginable as each one waited, powerless to learn if they would have another day of life or face an immediate and cruel end. Part of the barbed wire fence and the barracks where prisoners were kept in the Auschwitz camp. The electrified fence, watched over by armed guards, prevented any escape attempts. The barracks, designed to house hundreds of people, often housed thousands in unsanitary and inhumane conditions. Soviet Red Cross doctors stand among prisoners, including many children, in the Auschwitz concentration camp shortly before its liberation on January 27, 1945. This photograph captured the arrival of deportees at the Auschwitz concentration camp. In the background, the crematory chimneys already emitted smoke, a tragic omen of the fate of many who disembarked there. This is Kiwa, marked with a tattoo in Auschwitz, like an animal, bearing on his arm the cruel symbol of his dehumanization. This permanent mark accompanied him through every horror he endured, especially in Spaichingen, the camp he described as the most terrible of all. In this iconic image, a Russian survivor of Buchenwald, newly liberated by the 3rd United States Armored Division, confronts and identifies a former camp guard responsible for brutal beatings of prisoners on April 14, 1945. Anne Frank, with a serene gaze, poses in Amsterdam, where she lived before being taken by Nazi forces in 1941. In August 1944, after 2 years in hiding, Anne and her family were captured and sent to concentration camps. Anne died of typhus in Bergen-Belsen at the age of 15, but her diary, published posthumously, became an eternal symbol of resistance and the voice of the millions of Jewish victims of the Holocaust. The arrival of a group of Hungarian Jews at Auschwitz-Birkenau, transported in overcrowded cattle cars. Prisoners disembarked at the so-called death ramp, where Nazi officers carried out the selection. The majority, including women, children, and the elderly, were sent directly to the gas chambers. Only a few were chosen for forced labor. A Nazi train packed with Jews on the way to the Auschwitz concentration camp. Prisoners were transported in freight cars without windows, ventilation, or seats. The journey lasted days, and many died before reaching the destination due to hunger, thirst, cold, or extreme heat. Each car, designed for cattle or goods, was overcrowded with up to 100 people, with no space to move. Arthur Greiser alongside Nazi soldiers. As governor of the occupied Polish territory known as Reichsgau Wartheland, Greiser was one of the main responsible for implementing the Holocaust in the region. He ordered the persecution and extermination of the Jewish population, as well as the mass deportation to concentration and extermination camps. An abandoned brick building at the Auschwitz concentration camp after its liberation. These buildings served as housing for prisoners forced to live under inhumane conditions. Many of these structures were left empty when the Nazis evacuated the camp before the Allies arrived, forcing thousands of prisoners on death marches. After the liberation, Soviet soldiers found weakened survivors and evidence of the Nazi genocide. The collective dormitories in a Nazi concentration camp where prisoners were crammed into inhumane conditions. They were made of wood with no insulation against the cold or heat and were lined only with straw or hay. Each bed could accommodate several people who slept squeezed together without blankets and exposed to diseases. The lack of hygiene combined with malnutrition and forced labor led many to death. Jews in the collective dormitories of a Nazi concentration camp, lying in overcrowded wooden bunks. Without mattresses or proper blankets, many used hay, straw, or even pots as pillows to try to rest. The lack of hygiene and ventilation promoted the spread of epidemics, while overcrowding made rest nearly impossible. A dissection table at the Majdanek concentration camp in Poland. The camp housed gas chambers, crematoria, and medical facilities where prisoners were subjected to experiments and forced autopsies. Bodies of victims, often taken from the gas chambers, were dissected for pseudoscientific research conducted by Nazi doctors. Survivors of the Block of Children number 66 at Buchenwald concentration camp, photographed shortly after liberation. This special barrack housed hundreds of Jewish children and teenagers, many of whom had been deported from Auschwitz and other Nazi camps. The block was created by resistance prisoners within the camp, who managed to protect some children from forced labor and executions. A cell in Auschwitz, with marks scratched on the walls, left by the prisoners who were held there. These cells were used for confinement before executions, brutal interrogations, or as a form of extreme punishment. Many prisoners spent days or weeks in these small rooms without food or water in total isolation. The gallows used to execute prisoners at Fort Breendonk, a Nazi detention camp located in Belgium. The fort, originally a military fortification, was transformed by the Nazis into a center for torture and execution of resistance members, Jews, and opponents of the regime. Many prisoners were forced to dig their own graves before being executed. Through the barbed wire, the barracks of the Flossenburg concentration camp in Germany emerge as a symbol of horror in 1942. Surrounded by maximum security measures, the camp was not only a place of confinement, but also a scene of slow and brutal extermination. The Drancy camp in France between 1941 and 1944, a concrete purgatory for Jewish prisoners. Originally a housing complex, it became a grim funnel to Auschwitz. Newly arrived prisoners at the Buchenwald camp in Germany between 1938 and 1940 faced dehumanization from the start. With their heads shaved and forced to line up under strict surveillance, they were stripped of their identity and subjected to a routine of humiliation and fear. In this photograph, a crowd of prisoners, lined up and silent, awaited roll call in Buchenwald in 1938. Many were Jews captured during Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, with empty gazes and shaved heads. Adolf Hitler speaks at a stormtroopers rally in Dortmund, Germany in 1933. Shortly after, he announced the expansion of concentration camps, marking the beginning of systematic repression. 3 children survivors pose in the Bad Reichenhall displaced persons camp in Germany in 1945. Their faces carry the innocence of childhood and the marks of a dark past in Nazi concentration camps. This image captures the early view of the Dachau concentration camp, surrounded by barbed wire and structures symbolizing the start of the brutal Nazi machine. Opened in Germany on May 24, 1933, it was the first camp created for systematic repression. This was the barbed wire fence that separated the Krakow ghetto from the rest of the city. Located in occupied Poland, the ghetto imprisoned thousands of Jews under inhumane conditions before many were deported to concentration camps. This photograph captures a man and a Jewish girl working under coercion in a factory in the Lodz ghetto, Poland. Forced into slave labor, many were required to produce goods for the Nazi regime while facing hunger, disease, and inhumane conditions. A line of prisoners walks toward the Belzec extermination camp in Poland in 1942. Belzec was one of the first camps of Operation Reinhard, created exclusively for the extermination of Jews. It is estimated that around 600,000 people were murdered there, mainly in gas chambers, in one of the most brutal campaigns of the Nazi Holocaust. This aerial photograph, taken on August 25, 1944, shows the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp in Poland. Identifiable in the photo are the gas chambers and crematoria 2 and 3, where thousands of Jews were murdered daily. Prisoners work as slaves in the construction of an extension of the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp in Poland between 1942 and 1943. In an unimaginable cruelty, they were forced to expand the very camp where they would be confined and, for many, exterminated. In this image, German soldiers guard prisoners of war at the Rovno camp in Poland on June 22, 1941. While Jews were the primary targets of the Nazi regime, Soviet prisoners of war also faced extreme brutality, including starvation, disease, and mass executions. Prisoners march carrying bowls at the Dachau concentration camp in Germany between 1933 and 1940. Dachau was the first Nazi camp created for political prisoners, Jews, and minorities. In this photo, survivors of the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria celebrate and salute American soldiers passing through the main gate on May 9, 1945. In this photo, American soldiers enter the Buchenwald concentration camp in Germany shortly after its liberation on April 11, 1945. Being one of the first camps liberated by Allied forces, its entrance symbolized relief for the survivors. A devastating and cruel air raid carried out by the Germans themselves on the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland in August 1944. This attack, besides causing destruction, exemplified the extreme brutality of the Nazi regime, which did not hesitate to sacrifice even the prisoners already subjected to inhumane conditions. In this photo, candles illuminate the train tracks that once carried thousands to their deaths at Auschwitz-Birkenau, in an emotional ceremony marking the 60th anniversary of the camp's liberation on January 27, 2005. This image captured the desperation of prisoners crowded behind the gates of Auschwitz, Poland, shortly before liberation by the Soviet Army in January 1945. The showers at Majdanek, seemingly harmless at first glance, hid the indescribable horror of the concentration camp. Located near Lublin, Poland, these showers were part of the disinfection process before leading prisoners, mostly Jews, to the gas chambers. This image, in a profoundly tragic manner, depicts the condition of Jews in Nazi concentration camps. Many succumbed to hunger or contagious diseases even before facing execution. A clandestine record of a death march leaving Auschwitz. Prisoners were forced to walk under Nazi surveillance, enduring hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Some of these photos were taken by witnessing civilians who risked their own lives to document the atrocities and share them with the world. Prisoners rescued from the Vöbelen concentration camp in Germany in 1945 display the horrors they endured during the Holocaust. Marked by hunger and cruelty, they were in an extreme state of malnutrition. The crematorium ovens at the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland represent one of the horrors of the Nazi regime. Thousands of victims, after being murdered in gas chambers, had their bodies incinerated in these ovens, erasing any trace of their existence. An American soldier stands inside a gas chamber at the Dachau concentration camp in 1945. Stacked against the wall are 5 wooden coffins waiting for the bodies of victims. A survivor child, extremely thin, being carried by Soviet rescuers after the liberation of a Nazi concentration camp. Many were sick, malnourished, and too weak to walk. Medical teams provided first aid, but recovery was difficult, especially for children who had endured extreme deprivation. Prisoners performing forced labor in the Dachau concentration camp under the watch of Nazi officers during an inspection. Prisoners were forced to work in extreme conditions, often in factories linked to the German war effort, in quarries, or in construction projects. Inspections by Nazi officers ensured that prisoners followed orders under strict discipline. An aerial view of the Gurs concentration camp, located in southern France. Gurs was established in 1939, initially as an internment camp for Spanish refugees, and later used by the Nazis during World War II to house prisoners, primarily Jews. Prisoners from Auschwitz performing forced labor in a Siemens factory. They were forced to work under extreme conditions, without proper food, and under constant surveillance. Many could not withstand the exhaustion, cold, and mistreatment. The quarry at the Gross Rosen concentration camp, located in Poland, where prisoners were forced to work under extreme conditions. The quarry was one of the main sources of forced labor, and prisoners were exploited to support the Nazi arms industry. Newly arrived Jews undergoing the selection process at the Birkenau platform shortly after disembarking from the trains. Prisoners wearing striped uniforms, known as Sonderkommando, were forced to assist with unloading and organizing the newcomers. These selections occurred rapidly, sending thousands to their deaths daily. Female prisoners entering the women's section of Auschwitz already wearing prisoner uniforms, while an SS guard watches. After arrival at the camp, women were stripped of their clothing and belongings, had their heads shaved, and were given a numbered tattoo on their arms. Men and women in the barracks area of Auschwitz after surviving the first selection. Sick, exhausted, or unable prisoners were quickly discarded and executed. The life expectancy of prisoners in the camps was short, as the Nazi system used forced labor as a method of slow extermination. Newly arrived Jews undergoing the selection process at the Birkenau platform shortly after disembarking from the trains. Prisoners wearing striped uniforms, known as Sonderkommando, were forced to assist with unloading and organizing the newcomers. These selections occurred rapidly, sending thousands to their deaths daily. United Nations officials vaccinating an 11-year-old girl, a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp, who had been a victim of Nazi medical experiments. International organizations provided aid to survivors, offering medical treatment and vaccinations to combat infections and epidemics that spread in the camps after the war. Prisoners pouring cement during the construction of the crematorium and the third gas chamber at Birkenau, part of the Auschwitz complex. Work began in 1942 when the Nazis expanded the camp structure to accelerate mass extermination. Prisoners were forced to build the extermination sites themselves, under extreme surveillance and brutal conditions of hunger and exhaustion. The Auschwitz crematorium, photographed after the camp's liberation. These facilities were used by the Nazis to incinerate the bodies of victims murdered in the gas chambers or killed by hunger, disease, and forced labor. The crematoriums operated non-stop to eliminate evidence of the mass extermination. A crematorium and gas chamber at Auschwitz. The bodies of the victims were removed by prisoners forced to work in the Sonderkommando and incinerated in the crematorium ovens. Survivors in the barracks at Dachau concentration camp shortly after its liberation by the United States Army. After years of hunger, disease, and forced labor, prisoners were extremely weakened, and many could barely move. Dachau, one of the first Nazi camps, operated since 1933 and housed tens of thousands of prisoners subjected to brutal conditions. Two survivors preparing food outside a barrack at Dachau concentration camp in Germany. The man on the right is presumably Jean Voste, the only known black prisoner in Dachau. Born in Belgian Congo, he was arrested by the Nazis for resistance activities and deported to the camp, where he suffered the same brutal conditions of hunger, forced labor, and mistreatment as other prisoners. Prisoners near the electrified fence applauding the American soldiers during the liberation of Dachau concentration camp. Some prisoners are wearing the characteristic blue and white striped uniform of the camp detainees. Cans of Zyklon B, a poison used by the Nazis during the Holocaust to carry out mass killings in concentration camps. Zyklon B was the primary toxic substance used in gas chambers. Adolf Hitler and some of his main officers during World War II. Along with his officers, he implemented policies that led to the Holocaust, the systematic persecution and extermination of around 6 million Jews, as well as millions of other victims, such as gypsies, prisoners of war, and disabled people. The main entrance of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Above the Iron Gate is the German phrase Arbeit macht frei, which means work sets you free, a cruel illusion for the prisoners arriving at the site. Female prisoners inside a barrack at Auschwitz concentration camp. Housed in overcrowded wooden bunks, without mattresses or proper blankets, they faced hunger, cold, and disease in unsanitary conditions. Many were weakened by forced labor and extreme malnutrition. An abandoned wooden barrack at Auschwitz. When the Nazis evacuated the camp, they forced thousands of prisoners to march under freezing temperatures to other camps, leaving behind only those too weak to walk. After liberation, Soviet soldiers found these empty barracks filled with traces of the suffering experienced there. The entrance gate to the Buchenwald concentration camp with the iron inscription Jedem das Seine, which means to each what he deserves. The phrase on the gate reflected Nazi propaganda used to justify the persecution of prisoners. The deportation of Jews from Munich to Kauno in Nazi-occupied Lithuania. In November of 1941, hundreds of Jews were forced to board trains bound for Fort 9, a site used by the Nazis for mass executions. American troops finding looted goods hidden in a church in Germany, containing belongings confiscated from the victims of Nazi concentration camps. After the liberation of the camps and the occupation of German territories in 1945, the Allies discovered secret caches where the Nazis stored jewelry, artworks, money, and other items stolen from prisoners. Prisoners at Dachau concentration camp looking through the fence shortly before liberation by the United States Army. Two prisoners from Lager Nordhausen concentration camp shortly after their liberation. Lager Nordhausen was part of the Mittelbau-Dora complex, where thousands of prisoners were forced to work in the production of V-2 rockets for the Nazi army. A group of survivors smiling under the entrance gate of Auschwitz shortly after liberation. At the moment of liberation, thousands of prisoners were severely weakened, but for many, the arrival of the soldiers meant a new chance at life. Even after liberation, recovery was long, and many never reunited with their families. A group of female prisoners wearing striped uniforms and headscarves at a Nazi concentration camp. These standardized clothes were given upon arrival at the camp when prisoners had their belongings confiscated and their heads shaved. Prisoners who were liberated by the Red Army when Soviet troops arrived at the Auschwitz concentration camp. About 7,600 people were still alive, many in critical condition due to hunger, disease, and years of mistreatment. Most of the prisoners had been forced to march to other camps before the Soviets arrived, in the so-called death marches, where thousands died. Raised mounds of earth marking some of the 13 mass graves at the site of the former Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. After the liberation of the camp by British forces, soldiers found thousands of bodies scattered across the grounds, the result of hunger, disease, and mistreatment suffered by the prisoners. Due to the risk of epidemics, the victims were buried in mass graves, some containing thousands of bodies. the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto by the Nazis after the ghetto uprising. After weeks of resistance by Jewish fighters against German troops, the Nazis decided to eliminate the ghetto completely. Buildings were set on fire, entire streets were demolished, and thousands of Jews were killed or captured. The main entrance to the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination camp in Poland. The gate, with a central tower and train tracks leading directly to the camp, was the final path for more than 1 million prisoners, mostly Jews, who were sent to die in the gas chambers. Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest and deadliest camp of the Holocaust, operating from 1942 to 1945. Bags filled with human hair, cut from female prisoners, were found in the Auschwitz extermination camp after its liberation in 1945. This hair, prepared for shipment to Germany, was used by the Nazi machine in industries, symbolizing the total dehumanization of the victims.